Many people believe China wants to become the next global empire. The logic is simple. Every great power in history eventually wants more influence, more control, and more power. So as China rises, many assume it will follow the same path. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if China does not think about power the same way Western countries do? This is the question former Singapore Foreign Minister George Yeo has been exploring for years. He argues that one of the biggest mistakes people make is judging China through a Western lens. So, is China really trying to replace America? Or are we misunderstanding China's rise? Let's hear what George Yeo has to say.
Do you think the West is right in believing that when China becomes powerful, it will behave the same way as Western powers did, use its military, conquer territories, and become an imperial power? What does Chinese history tell us about how China will behave as a great power?
The Chinese have thought through the implications of their own rise very deeply and over a long period of time. Deng Xiaoping told his own people, keep a low profile, hide your shine. Because he knew that sooner or later, China's reemergence will create countervailing forces, and it's best to defer it for as long as possible. That it's in China's interest, and that it's in the interest of the major powers. Because if major powers press upon China before it was strong, then it could easily lead to a new conflict, like during the Korean War. Then China will have to fight prematurely. But if that fateful contest were to be deferred, China will be much stronger and could better manage conflict so that wars become unnecessary. The Chinese view of warfare is avoid it whenever possible. If you have to fight, it means you're not a good strategist. So even though Sun Tzu Bing Fa, The Art of War, is not a classified text, it is the single most important document to understand Chinese strategic thinking and the thinking on warfare. And the Chinese are not a missionary power. It is an arrogant civilization. It doesn't believe that anybody else can become like them. And that if you are Chinese, then you can be governed using Confucianist principles, and you could have peace on earth and a very productive economy. But they have no wish to go around telling Laotians and Bruneians and Singaporeans how we should govern ourselves, because they know how difficult it is for they themselves to govern themselves. It's very different from the American approach, which is it's a manifest destiny. These are not Western values. These are universal values. And therefore values which you will naturally want to imbibe when you're free. They're given a choice. Our values will be your values. And it was seductive. I think for a whole generation, the Asian dream was America. Many of us studied there, whether consciously or subconsciously. We adopted the vocabulary, the intellectual constructs, the view of history. And then we look at ourselves through Western prisms. And the Western media, of course, became very important. But the rise of China, because it has a different starting point and a different worldview, will have huge consequences. In the US in the last 3 years, the mood has turned so dramatically toxic. It's almost unbelievable. And for many of us, it's painful because we used to be able to talk about China in a very relaxed and calm way with our American friends. Today, they're so prickly. And we're very careful what we say in order not to cause offense, sometimes at the risk of not telling the whole truth, because the whole truth will cause offense and rupture relationships. That's a sad state we are in. But it had its origin much earlier. I would say from the Obama days, the pivot to the East, the pivot to the Western Pacific, their strategic thinkers were already viewing China as an increasingly grave threat to US dominance in the world.
So according to Giorgio, the biggest misunderstanding about China comes from one simple assumption. People assume that every rising power wants the same thing. They assume that when a country becomes wealthy and powerful, it naturally wants to go out into the world, control other nations, and spread its own systems. And that assumption comes from looking at history through a Western lens. Because when we look at the rise of many Western powers, expansion was a major part of their story. European countries built overseas empires. They controlled territories thousands of miles away. They spread their languages, cultures, religions, and political systems across different continents. Later, the United States also developed a strong belief that its values and institutions represented the best model for the world. So when people see China becoming powerful today, many naturally expect China to do the same thing. But Giorgio argues that this is where the misunderstanding begins. China has a very different historical experience. For thousands of years, China has viewed itself less like a country trying to build an overseas empire and more like a civilization trying to maintain stability within its own borders. This is why China is often described as a civilizational state. The idea is that China doesn't necessarily see itself as a normal nation trying to compete with other nations. Instead, it sees itself as an ancient civilization with its own identity, culture, and way of thinking. And from this perspective, China does not necessarily believe that everyone else needs to become Chinese. A country like Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, or Thailand can have its own culture, political system, and traditions. China's traditional approach has been less about converting others into its own image and more about maintaining its own stability. Now, of course, this doesn't mean China has no ambitions or that it has never had conflicts with other countries. Every major power has interests, and China is no exception. But the argument here is that China may not be playing the same game that Western powers historically played. And this difference becomes even clearer when we look at how China and the United States approach military power. The US has hundreds of military bases around the world and spends close to $1 trillion a year on defense. America's strategy has traditionally been about maintaining global influence through alliances, military presence, and the ability to project power anywhere on Earth. China's approach has been very different. Beijing spends much less as a percentage of its economy on defense and has historically focused much more on building strength at home. This connects with an important idea from the ancient Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu. In The Art of War, Sun Tzu said the greatest victory is not winning 100 battles. The greatest victory is winning without having to fight. This idea is deeply connected to traditional Chinese strategic thinking. The goal is not always to show strength by constantly using force. Sometimes the strongest position is making sure your opponent knows that fighting you would be too costly. In other words, real power is not always about attacking. Sometimes real power is about making sure nobody wants to attack you in the first place. This also explains why China's leaders have often focused heavily on economic development. Former Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping famously encouraged China to hide its strength and bide its time. The message was simple: don't rush into confrontation before you are ready. Focus on developing your economy, improving technology, strengthening your country, and becoming more influential over the long term. And that strategy has shaped China's rise over the past few decades. Instead of building a global empire through military conquest, China focused on becoming the world's manufacturing center, building infrastructure, expanding trade, and creating economic relationships around the world. Now, this doesn't mean everyone agrees with China's approach. There are legitimate debates about China's policies, its relationship with neighboring countries, and how much influence Beijing should have globally. those discussions are important. But if we want to understand the future of US-China relations, we have to understand one thing. China may not be trying to become the next America. China may be trying to become China. The United States often views global leadership through the ideas of shaping the world around its values. China's traditional approach has been more focused on building internal strength and creating influence through economic connections. These are two very different ways of looking at power. And maybe that is why the rivalry between Washington and Beijing is so complicated. Because both sides may be looking at the same world, but they are interpreting it through completely different historical experiences. The real question is not whether China will become more powerful. The bigger question is, as China rises, will the world understand China's ambitions correctly, or will everyone continue judging China by the history of other great powers? So what do you think? Is China really trying to become the next global superpower, or are we looking at China through the wrong lens? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more in-depth analysis on Asia and global affairs. Thank you for watching.